This incident occurred about a year ago, during the final exams of my last year in high school. It was a stressful time. Every moment felt critical, and I was determined to make the most of it. Like most students, I had procrastinated a bit, and still had a lot to cover. My school had decided to extend the library's hours until 11 p.m. for students preparing for exams, and I thought it was a great opportunity. Normally, the library closed at 5 p.m., but these extended hours were perfect for quiet, focused study time. My home was just a 10-minute walk from school, which made it convenient for me to stay late. At home, there were always distractions. The noise of the TV, chores my parents needed help with, and my younger siblings constantly interrupting me. The library, on the other hand, was peaceful and organized, a space where I could truly concentrate. That evening, I packed my notes and left for school at 6 p.m. When I arrived, the library had its usual buzz. A handful of students were scattered across the large study tables, their heads buried in books. Some were typing furiously on their laptops, while others flipped through notes, their pens racing to underline key points. I picked my favorite spot, a cozy corner by the window overlooking the school courtyard. It was quiet there, away from the main walkway, and I could focus without interruptions. As the evening wore on, the library gradually emptied. By 8 p.m., only a few students were left. The librarian, a kind but stern woman in her 50s, walked around reminding everyone to keep the noise down. I was too immersed in my notes to pay much attention, but I vaguely noticed the library becoming quieter and quieter. When I next looked up, the clock on the wall read 10 p.m. My heart sank slightly. I had never stayed this late before. By now, the library was completely deserted. Even the librarian seemed to have left her desk. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound, a constant reminder of the stillness around me. I told myself I'd stay just 15 more minutes to finish the chapter one was working on. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, like slow, uneven footsteps coming from the hallway outside the library. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. I brushed it off as my imagination, but as the sound grew louder, I froze. It wasn't the steady rhythm of someone walking casually. These footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and irregular. It almost sounded like someone dragging one foot behind the other. My chest tightened as I tried to focus on my book, convincing myself it was probably just the janitor or another student. The footsteps stopped right outside the library door. I stared at the glass doors, half expecting to see someone walk in, but no one did. My heartbeat quickened as I sat there, holding my breath. After what felt like an eternity, I decided it was time to leave. I quickly gathered my things and headed toward the exit. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I regretted staying so late. The corridor outside the library was dimly lit, with a few flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. As I started walking, the faint echo of my footsteps filled the hallway, making me feel like I wasn't alone. At the far end of the corridor, I noticed a figure standing near the wall. It was a woman. She wasn't moving, just standing there, slightly hunched over. My stomach dropped. Who would be here at this hour? I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to turn back. "Excuse me?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, her posture rigid. Then she moved slowly, awkwardly, as if her legs didn't work properly. She shuffled toward the adjacent hallway, disappearing around the corner. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe she was a staff member or someone from the janitorial team. Still, my instincts told me to leave as quickly as possible. I walked briskly toward the main door, every step filled with a growing sense of urgency. When I finally stepped outside, the cold night air hit me, but it didn't bring the relief I was hoping for. The street in front of the school, usually bustling even late at night, was eerily empty. No cars, no pedestrians, just the sound of distant wind rustling through the trees. I clutched my bag tightly and began walking home, keeping my head down and my ears alert for any sound. The quiet was unnerving. About halfway down the street, I thought I heard footsteps again. I stopped and turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was empty. I let out a shaky breath and told myself I was being paranoid. But when I looked down, I saw a shadow moving on the ground, one that didn't belong to me. I snapped my head up and saw her. The woman from the school hallway was now in front of me, a few feet away. My blood ran cold. How had she gotten here so quickly? Her appearance was clearer now. She was wearing tattered clothes, and her hair was wild and matted. Her movements were labored, her body hunched as if she were carrying an invisible weight. I froze, unable to move. She seemed to sense my fear because she paused and turned her head slightly toward me. Her voice was low and hoarse as she said, "Have you seen my daughter?" I couldn't respond. My throat felt dry, and my legs refused to move. She repeated the question, this time louder, with a hint of desperation. "Have you seen my daughter?" Finally, I managed to raise a trembling hand and point in a random direction. She stared at me for a moment before limping away toward the direction I'd indicated. I stood there, paralyzed, until she disappeared into the shadows. Without wasting another second, I turned and sprinted the rest of the way home. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the door shut and collapsed on the couch, my heart racing. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my neighbor about the incident. He explained that the woman might have been someone struggling with mental health issues who was occasionally seen wandering near the school. Though the experience shook me to my core, knowing there was a possible explanation for it brought some comfort. Even now, whenever I think about that night, I feel a chill run down my spine. It was a reminder of how the most ordinary places, like a school library, can feel terrifying under the right circumstances. I never liked staying after school. The building always felt different when it was empty, like the absence of hundreds of students left behind a kind of vacuum. But Mr. Grayson didn't care about my preferences. "Maybe an extra hour of silence will teach you to respect the rules," he had said, wagging his finger as if I were 5 instead of 17. Detention wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was how late it was when he finally let me go. By then, the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the hallways dim and eerily quiet. Black Ridge High after hours wasn't just empty, it felt abandoned. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and stepped into the main hallway. The hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. Some of them flickered, casting jittery shadows along the walls. Most of the teachers had already gone home. Even the janitor was nowhere to be seen. I told myself to stop overthinking. I just needed to grab my stuff from my locker and leave. The sound of my sneakers echoed as I walked, the sharp squeak against the linoleum louder than I remembered. The lockers on either side loomed, their metal doors dented and scratched with years of wear. Halfway to my locker, I heard it, a faint tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. It was faint, but distinct, like someone knocking on one of the lockers. "Hello," I called out. The sound stopped. I turned around, scanning the hallway. Nothing, just the same empty stretch of lockers and shadows. My pulse slowed, and I shook my head. Probably just the building settling, I thought. This school was ancient, and it creaked like an old house when the wind hit it just right. I kept walking, telling myself to hurry up. The tapping started again, louder this time. It came from somewhere ahead of me, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it hard to tell exactly where. I stopped again, this time gripping the straps of my backpack like they might protect me. "Who's there?" Silence. For a moment, I thought about running, but then I reminded myself I wasn't a little kid. Maybe it was just another student, someone sneaking around. Or maybe the janitor was messing with me. Still, my steps were slower now, more hesitant. When I reached my locker, I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. I tried to focus on the numbers, 14, 32, 9, but my ears were straining for the slightest sound. The locker door creaked open, and I grabbed my bag in one quick motion. That's when I noticed it. A folded piece of paper sitting neatly on the top shelf. I didn't put that there. My stomach twisted as I reached for it. The paper was worn, as though someone had folded and unfolded it 100 times. When I opened it, the handwriting was jagged and rushed. "You're not alone." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I spun around, scanning the hallway again. Still nothing. Just the flickering lights and the eerie hum. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't stop thinking. Who wrote this? How did it get into my locker? And then I heard it, footsteps. Not my own. They were soft at first, coming from down the hall. Slowly, steadily, they grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat. I clutched my bag, my mind racing. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry, but they wanted me to hear them. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the corner where the sound seemed to be coming from. My pulse was hammering, so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. When the footsteps stopped, I froze. "Who's there?" I called out again, my voice shaking. Nothing. I inched backward, toward the exit, when suddenly a locker door slammed shut down the hall. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence, and I jumped. I didn't wait to see what was happening. I bolted toward the nearest stairwell, my feet pounding against the floor. The tapping started again, faster now, almost frantic, and this time it seemed to come from everywhere. The walls, the lockers, even the ceiling. I stumbled into the stairwell and leaned against the cold concrete wall, gasping for air. My hands were trembling, and my bag felt like a dead weight on my shoulder. The tapping stopped. I waited, listening, but the silence was worse. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I didn't want to go back into the hallway, but I couldn't stay there either. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. The second-floor hallway was worse. The lights here weren't just flickering. They were mostly out, leaving long stretches of darkness. I tried to walk quietly, but every step echoed like a shout. As I passed the science lab, the door creaked open. My breath caught. I didn't want to look inside, but something compelled me. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. Rows of overturned chairs and scattered papers filled the space. And then I saw it. A single chair in the middle of the room, tilted at an unnatural angle. On the desk in front of it was another note. I stepped closer, my legs shaking, and picked it up. "I see you." A shadow moved at the edge of the room. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps drowning out everything else. I didn't stop until I reached the exit doors. When I shoved them open and stumbled into the cold night air, the relief was overwhelming. I leaned against the wall, sucking in deep breaths. But as I looked back at the school, I froze. In the second-floor window, silhouetted against the faint glow of the emergency lights, was a figure. It stood perfectly still, watching me, and then it waved. I didn't go back to school the next day, or the day after, but the tapping, I still hear it sometimes, late at night, just as I'm about to fall asleep. And every time, it's followed by the faint sound of footsteps. It was a cold, crisp autumn evening, and our school bus had been steadily winding its way through the mountains for hours. The excitement of the trip had long faded into restless murmurs, groans, and quiet snoring as night fell. We were on our way to a weekend retreat, a trip our school had organized to build character and teamwork. But when the bus sputtered to a halt on a deserted mountain road, the night took a strange turn. The driver, a gruff older man named Mr. Cartwright, swore under his breath and muttered something about the engine overheating. He and the teachers held a hurried conference, and within minutes, they decided we'd need to find shelter for the night. "There's a lodge nearby," Mrs. Simmons, our English teacher, announced. "We'll stay there until morning when we can get help." The lodge, Pinewood Lodge, was nestled in the middle of the forest, surrounded by tall, ancient trees that seemed to close in as we approached. The wooden sign out front was faded and splintered, and the building itself looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. "This place gives me the creeps," Jake whispered as we shuffled inside. "I think it's kinda cool," Ryan said. "Like something out of a horror movie." We were assigned rooms quickly. I ended up sharing with Jake and Ryan, my two best friends. We dropped our bags and looked out the window. From there, we could see a lake gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It was surrounded by dense trees, the water as still as glass. "That lake," Ryan said, "reminds me of what happened on last year's trip." I nodded, remembering the story. Two kids had snuck out at night to explore, and came back with wild tales of finding a hidden cave. They were the talk of the school for weeks. Jake grinned mischievously. "What do you think? Should we top that story?" It didn't take much convincing. The three of us decided we'd sneak out after the teachers went to bed and head to the lake. We waited until the lodge was silent. The teachers had all retired to their rooms, and the night watchman's flashlight beam had disappeared as he settled into his chair near the entrance. Jake, Ryan, and I slipped out, using our phone flashlights to light the way. The lake didn't look far from the lodge, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the stranger things became. The path, which had seemed so clear at first, became tangled with roots and overgrown branches. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to loom larger, their branches stretching toward us like claws. "Guys, are we even going the right way?" Jake asked, his voice uneasy. "Of course," Ryan replied, though his confidence seemed forced. "It's just a little further." We pressed on, but the path seemed endless. After what felt like an hour, I suggested we turn back. "This isn't worth it," I said. "Let's just head back before." A sound behind us made me freeze. Footsteps. We turned, expecting to see the night watchman or a teacher, but there was no one there. "Ryan," Jake said suddenly. "Where's Ryan?" I spun around. Ryan, who had been walking just behind us, was gone. "Ryan!" Jake shouted. We heard no reply, only the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, faintly, we heard footsteps again, moving deeper into the forest. "Come on," I said, grabbing Jake's arm. "We can't leave him out here." We followed the sound, the beams of our flashlights flickering as the woods seemed to grow darker. The footsteps led us to a clearing, where we found Ryan crouched on the ground, digging with his hands like a wild animal. "Ryan," I called. He didn't look up. His fingers clawed at the dirt, his breathing shallow and erratic. "What are you doing?" Jake asked, stepping closer. Ryan slowly turned to face us. His eyes were black, not just dark, but completely void of color. His face was pale and expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. Jake took a step back. "What's wrong with you?" Before we could do anything, Ryan lunged at Jake, knocking him to the ground with a strength that didn't seem possible. Jake cried out as Ryan pinned him down, his black eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made my stomach turn. "Stop it!" I shouted, grabbing Ryan's shoulder. At my touch, he convulsed violently, then collapsed. Jake scrambled to his feet, his face pale. "What the hell just happened?" Jake whispered. Ryan stirred, his eyes returning to normal. Where am I?" We didn't have time to answer. Jake's flashlight flickered, and in the weak light, I saw his eyes darken, just as Ryan's had moments before. Without a word, he stood and bolted into the forest. "Jake!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. We chased him, our hearts pounding. The forest seemed to close in around us, the air growing colder with every step. Finally, we saw Jake ahead, standing at the door of a crumbling cabin. The cabin looked ancient, its roof sagging and its windows boarded up. The door creaked open as Jake stepped inside. "Jake, wait!" Ryan called, but he didn't respond. Inside, the air was heavy and suffocating. In the center of the room, Jake hung limply in the air, suspended by an invisible force. Before him stood an old woman. Her hair was a wild tangle of white, her skin sagging and gray. Her eyes were black voids, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "She's talking to him," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to get him out of here," I said. The woman turned to us, her movements unnaturally quick. Her gaze locked on me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "Run!" Ryan shouted. We bolted from the cabin, the woman's guttural laughter echoing behind us. We ran until we reached the lake. I could barely breathe, but relief washed over me when I saw the familiar shoreline. That relief was short-lived. Without warning, Ryan was yanked into the water. He screamed, thrashing against the invisible force pulling him under. "Help me!" he shouted. I tried to grab his hand, but he slipped beneath the surface. The water stilled, and Ryan was gone. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. Before I could process what had happened, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the lodge. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal, except for the police cars parked outside. I stumbled outside to find Jake and Ryan's bodies lying under white sheets. The teachers were talking to the police, their faces pale and shaken. "They drowned," one officer said. "Poor kids must have gotten lost and fallen in the lake." But the locals told a different story. "Years ago, a woman lived in these woods," an old man said. "The lodge was built on her land, and she refused to leave. Some men from the town drove her out, hurt her, and left her for dead in the lake. Ever since, her spirits haunted these woods, taking anyone foolish enough to disturb her. If we had known the truth, maybe Jake and Ryan would still be alive. But some secrets are only learned too late."